The morning air was crisp and cool, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass from the palace grounds. The sun had just begun its ascent into the sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestone pathways that wound around the grand structure. Tourists from all corners of the globe bustled about, eager to capture memories of their visit to one of the most iconic landmarks in the world. Some snapped selfies against the backdrop of towering columns and ornate statues, while others simply stood in awe, taking in the sheer magnificence of the architecture. Among the throng of visitors stood an elderly man, his presence quiet but unmistakable. His steps were slow and deliberate, each movement weighed down by years of experience etched into his weathered face. He wore a simple yet striking outfit, a faded military jacket adorned with rows of medals that glinted softly under the sunlight. Each medal told a story, a testament to battles fought, lives saved, and sacrifices made. Though his uniform was no longer pristine, it carried an aura of dignity and pride that drew curious glances from passers-by. Thomas, his name wasn't widely known here, nor did he seek recognition, had traveled far to see this place. For years he'd dreamed of visiting the palace, not out of curiosity for royalty or wealth, but because it represented something deeper to him. To Thomas, the palace symbolized resilience, tradition, and duty, values he'd clung to throughout his life as a soldier. Now, decades after hanging up his rifle, he found himself standing before the gates, feeling both nostalgic and humbled. As he approached the entrance, his gaze fell upon the royal guards stationed there. Clad in their bright red tunics and towering bearskin hats, they stood motionless like statues carved from stone. Their faces betrayed no emotion, their eyes fixed straight ahead as if nothing in the world could distract them. Children giggled and pointed at the imposing figures, while adults whispered jokes about how uncomfortable those heavy hats must be. Yet despite the light-hearted banter surrounding him, Thomas felt a profound sense of reverence. These guards weren't just part of a tourist attraction. They were guardians of history, protectors of something greater than themselves. For Thomas, seeing these young men reminded him of his own days in uniform. Back then, discipline and honor weren't just words. They were a way of life. He remembered, standing guard during the war, enduring freezing nights and blistering heat, always alert, always ready. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. And now, looking at the guards before him, he couldn't help but feel a connection, even though their roles were vastly different. His thoughts drifted back to the comrades he'd served alongside, the ones who hadn't made it home. They were more than just names on a list. They were brothers in arms, friends who had shared laughter, tears, and everything in between. Thomas often carried a small photograph of his unit in his pocket, a tangible reminder of the bond they once shared. Today, as he stood outside the palace gates, he felt their presence stronger than ever, urging him to pay tribute to the spirit of service that transcended time and place. With a deep breath, Thomas adjusted his cap and squared his shoulders. His body may have aged, but his heart remained steadfast. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand in a crisp salute. It was a gesture born of respect, gratitude, and solidarity. The movement caught the attention of the nearest guard, whose eyes flickered momentarily toward the elderly man before snapping back to their usual position. But even in that fleeting glance, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding that went beyond words. The crowd around Thomas barely noticed the exchange. Families continued snapping pictures, couples posed for Instagram-worthy shots, and children tugged at their parents' sleeves begging for ice cream. Life moved forward as usual, oblivious to the quiet moment unfolding near the palace gates. Yet for Thomas, this moment was everything. It was a chance to acknowledge the sacrifices of the past and honor the dedication of the present. Little did he know, however, that his simple act of respect would spark a chain reaction that would leave everyone around him deeply moved. As he lowered his hand, Thomas allowed himself a small smile. He didn't expect anything in return. His salute was meant as a personal gesture, a private acknowledgement of shared values. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest impact. The young royal guard, whose name was James, stood tall and unwavering in his position. His training had drilled into him the importance of maintaining composure at all times, no matter what happened around him. Yet, as he felt the weight of the elderly man's salute, something inside him shifted. It wasn't just a casual gesture from a tourist snapping photos or a child waving excitedly. It was deliberate, heartfelt, and deeply personal. For a moment, James forgot about the crowd, the palace, and even the centuries-old traditions that governed his every move. All he could think about was the man standing before him. James had always taken pride in his role as a royal guard. From the day he first donned the iconic red tunic and towering bearskin hat, he understood the gravity of his responsibilities. This wasn't just a job, it was a symbol of loyalty, discipline, and service to something greater than himself. But until now, he'd never truly considered how his duties connected him to those who served in other ways, like soldiers, firefighters, or anyone else who put themselves on the line for others. The veteran's salute reminded him of this shared sense of purpose, bridging the gap between two vastly different worlds. As James processed the significance of the moment, his mind raced with conflicting thoughts. On one hand, protocol demanded that he remain still and unresponsive, no matter what occurred. Breaking rank could result in disciplinary action, tarnishing not only his reputation but also the honor of the regiment. On the other hand, ignoring such a meaningful gesture felt wrong, almost disrespectful. The veteran hadn't come here seeking attention or praise. He'd simply wanted to express gratitude and acknowledge the connection they shared through service. How could James ignore that? His eyes darted briefly toward the sergeant overseeing the shift, stationed a few feet away. If James stepped out of line, the sergeant would surely notice. But when he glanced back at the elderly man, he saw something that stopped him cold. A look of quiet dignity mixed with vulnerability. Thomas's salute wasn't just a formality. It carried years of sacrifice, hardship, and memories of comrades lost. In that split second, James realized that adhering strictly to protocol might mean missing an opportunity to honor something far more important than rules. James's heart began to beat faster as he wrestled with his decision. He thought about the countless hours spent practicing drills, perfecting his posture, and learning to suppress emotion in public. These skills were essential for maintaining the image of stoic professionalism expected of a royal guard. But today felt different. Today wasn't just another routine shift. It was a chance to do something extraordinary, to recognize humanity over habit. The murmurs of the crowd faded into the background as James focused solely on the elderly man before him. He imagined what it must have been like for Thomas during his time in the military. The long marches, the sleepless nights, the moments of fear and courage intertwined. James couldn't claim to fully understand the depth of those experiences, but he didn't need to. What mattered was the respect and admiration he felt for someone who had given so much for their country. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James made up his mind. He knew there would be consequences for breaking protocol, but he also believed some things were worth the risk. With slow, measured movements, he shifted his stance ever so slightly. His muscles tensed as he prepared to step forward, knowing full well that this act would draw attention from everyone nearby. Still, he couldn't let the moment pass without acknowledging it. As James moved, the faint rustle of his boots against the pavement broke the silence. A few heads turned curiously, wondering why one of the usually immovable guards was stepping out of formation. Tourists paused mid-sentence, lowering their cameras and phones to see what was happening. Even the sergeant raised an eyebrow, though he remained silent for the time being. All eyes were now on James, and on the elderly man standing before him. With great care, James removed his bearskin hat, holding it close to his chest. The gesture alone was enough to elicit gasps from the crowd. Removing the hat was a rare occurrence, reserved for moments of deep respect or mourning. By doing so, James signaled that this was no ordinary interaction. Then, with a grace that belied the weight of the moment, he bowed deeply to the veteran. It wasn't a quick nod or a perfunctory dip of the head. It was a genuine, heartfelt expression of gratitude and solidarity. Thomas's reaction was immediate. His eyes widened in surprise, then softened with emotion. He hadn't expected any kind of response, let alone one so profound. For a brief moment he seemed unsure of what to do, his hands hovering near the brim of his own cap. Then, slowly, he nodded in return, his lips curling into a faint smile. Though no words were exchanged, the connection between them was undeniable. Two men, separated by age, experience, and circumstance, had found common ground in a single, powerful moment. Around them, the atmosphere shifted. The chatter of tourists gave way to hushed whispers as people tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. Some reached for their phones to record the scene, while others simply stood in stunned silence. A mother knelt beside her young son, explaining the significance of the exchange in hushed tones. "That man is a hero," she said softly, pointing to Thomas. "And that guard is showing him respect because heroes deserve to be honored." For James, the act of bowing brought a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, he felt a surge of pride, knowing he'd done the right thing. On the other, he couldn't shake the nervous anticipation of facing potential repercussions later. Would his superiors view his actions as admirable or reckless? Only time would tell. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the bond he'd forged with a stranger, a bond built on mutual respect and shared values. As the initial shock of the moment settled, the crowd began to react more visibly. Applause rippled through the gathering, starting softly, but growing louder as others joined in. Strangers patted James on the shoulder as they walked past, offering words of encouragement and admiration. One woman handed him a tissue, mistaking his flushed cheeks for tears, though he insisted he wasn't crying. Another man shook his hand firmly, thanking him for reminding everyone of the importance of honoring veterans. Meanwhile, Thomas stood, quietly, soaking in the warmth of the moment. He hadn't sought recognition, but he couldn't deny the impact of what had just transpired. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded photograph. It showed a group of young soldiers, their faces bright with laughter despite the hardships they faced. They were his unit, his brothers in arms, many of whom had paid the ultimate price. Holding the photo up briefly, he mouthed a silent message to James. They would have been proud. James nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He didn't need to say anything. The emotion in his eyes conveyed everything. As he returned to his post, replacing his hat and resuming his formal stance, the crowd erupted into cheers once more. People clapped, whistled, and called out words of gratitude, creating a symphony of appreciation that echoed across the palace grounds. And though James's face remained neutral, his heart swelled with pride, not for himself, but for the reminder that acts of kindness and respect could transcend barriers and unite us all. The moment James stepped back into his formal position, the ripple effect of his actions began to spread like waves across a still pond. The crowd, initially hushed in awe, erupted into animated conversations, each person eager to share their thoughts about what they had just witnessed. Some tourists clustered together, recounting every detail of the exchange with wide eyes and animated gestures. Others stood silently, absorbing the weight of the moment while a few wiped away tears that had welled up unexpectedly. Word of the incident traveled quickly among the other royal guards stationed nearby. Though their training demanded stoicism and focus, it was impossible for them to ignore the murmurs and applause rippling through the gathering. One by one, they discreetly turned their heads, just enough to catch a glimpse of James and the elderly veteran. Their faces remained impassive, but their eyes betrayed admiration for their comrade's boldness. Breaking protocol wasn't something taken lightly, especially in such a high-profile setting, yet none of them could fault James for his decision. If anything, his actions inspired a quiet sense of pride within the ranks. Even the sergeant overseeing the shift found himself caught between duty and emotion. Protocol dictated that he should address James immediately, either reprimanding him on the spot or pulling him aside for questioning. But as he watched the scene unfold, the heartfelt bow, the veteran's dignified nod, the spontaneous applause from the crowd, he hesitated. Something about the moment felt sacred, almost untouchable. For now, at least, he chose to let it pass, without comment, though he knew there would be discussions later. Meanwhile, the crowd continued to swell as more visitors were drawn to the commotion. People craned their necks to see what all the fuss was about, some even pushing forward to get a better view. A young couple holding hands stopped near the front, their expressions softening as they realized what had happened. "That's incredible," the woman whispered to her partner, clutching his arm tightly. "I've never seen anything like that." Nearby, a father knelt down beside his two children, explaining the significance of the moment in simple terms. "You see that older man over there?" he said, pointing toward Thomas. "He used to be a soldier, a very brave one. Those medals he's wearing mean he did important things to protect people. And that guard, you know, the one who bowed, he wanted to say thank you because soldiers like him deserve our respect." The kids listened intently, their eyes wide, with wonder, as if they were hearing a storybook tale come to life. Social media played its part too, amplifying the moment far beyond the palace grounds. Within minutes, videos of the interaction began flooding platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. Tourists who had recorded the scene shared clips alongside captions filled with praise. "This is why we remember," one post read. Another declared, "Respect has no rules." Comments poured in from users around the world, many expressing gratitude for the reminder of humanity's capacity for kindness. Some veterans chimed in, sharing their own stories and thanking James for honoring not just Thomas but all those who had served. Back at the center of it all, Thomas stood quietly, still processing the enormity of what had transpired. He hadn't expected this kind of reaction. Not from the guard, not from the crowd, and certainly not from strangers online. Yet here he was, surrounded by warmth and appreciation, feeling both humbled and overwhelmed. As people approached him, to shake his hand or offer words of thanks, he responded with gentle nods and quiet smiles, his humility shining through. One particularly emotional encounter came when a middle-aged woman approached him, tears streaming down her face. She introduced herself as the daughter of a veteran who had passed away years ago. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for reminding me of my dad. Seeing this today, it means so much." Thomas reached out to pat her, hand gently, unable to find the right words but hoping his gesture conveyed understanding. Moments like these reminded him why he had come here, to honor not only his fallen comrades but also the legacy of service that connected generations. As the morning wore on, the atmosphere remained electric. The usual bustle of tourists snapping photos and chatting idly had transformed into something deeper, more meaningful. Conversations shifted from casual observations about the architecture to reflections on sacrifice, duty, and gratitude. Even those who didn't fully understand the context of the moment couldn't help but feel moved by the raw emotion on display. James, too, became acutely aware of the impact his actions had sparked. Though he returned to his post with his characteristic stoicism, he could feel the weight of countless eyes lingering on him. Strangers approached him cautiously, asking if they could take a picture or simply thanking him for what he'd done. At first, he felt uncomfortable with the attention, unsure how to respond without violating protocol further. But as the hours passed, he began to embrace it, not for his own sake, but because it allowed him to reinforce the message behind his actions. Each time someone thanked him, he nodded slightly, letting his expression convey what words could not. By midday, the buzz surrounding the incident showed no signs of fading. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting snippets of the video alongside interviews with eyewitnesses. Reporters flocked to the palace gates, eager to speak with anyone involved. Thomas, however, declined requests for interviews, preferring to keep the focus on the broader message rather than himself. "It's not about me," he told a journalist kindly but firmly. "It's about remembering those who gave everything and showing respect where it's due." Despite the growing attention, the heart of the moment remained unchanged. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about connection. Two individuals from vastly different walks of life had bridged the gap between past and present, tradition and humanity. And in doing so, they had reminded everyone present, and eventually millions watching online, that acts of kindness, no matter how small, have the power to unite us. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting golden light over the palace grounds, the crowd began to disperse slowly. Families gathered their belongings. Couples lingered for a final photo, and children tugged at their parents' sleeves, ready to move on to the next adventure. But the memory of what had happened lingered, etched into the minds of all who had witnessed it. For many, it was a day they would talk about for years to come, a day when a simple salute sparked a chain reaction of respect, gratitude, and unity that transcended boundaries and touched hearts around the world. As the day wore on, the scene outside the palace gates began to shift in subtle yet profound ways. The initial burst of excitement and applause had settled into a quieter, more reflective tone, but the impact of what had happened continued to resonate deeply with everyone present. People lingered longer than they might have otherwise, reluctant to leave the spot where such an extraordinary moment had unfolded. Conversations buzzed softly among groups of tourists, families, and locals, alike, each person adding their own perspective to the story. For Thomas, the veteran, the attention was both heartwarming and overwhelming. He hadn't anticipated that his simple salute would spark such a powerful response, not just from the guard but from the entire crowd. Strangers approached him throughout the morning, some offering handshakes, others simply nodding in respect. A few couldn't hold back tears as they thanked him for his service, recounting how his actions reminded them of loved ones who had served or sacrificed. One elderly woman, clutching a cane, told him through sobs that her late husband had been a soldier too. "You're keeping his memory alive," she said, gripping his hand tightly. "Thank you for that." Thomas listened to every word, humbled by the outpouring of emotion. He didn't consider himself special. He saw himself as just one of many who had answered the call to serve. Yet he understood that moments like these mattered, not because they celebrated him personally, but because they kept the spirit of service alive. It wasn't about individual glory. It was about remembering the collective effort, the shared sacrifices, and the enduring values that bound people together across generations. Amidst the swirl of interactions, Thomas found himself reflecting on the young guard who had broken protocol to acknowledge him. That single bow had spoken volumes, a gesture so small yet so meaningful. It reminded him of the camaraderie he'd felt during his time in the military, when respect and gratitude weren't confined by rank or tradition. In James's actions, Thomas saw a reflection of the same principles he'd carried with him throughout his life: honor, humility, and a willingness to put others first. James, meanwhile, remained steadfast at his post, though the weight of the morning's events lingered with him. Every glance from passers-by seemed to carry a mix of admiration and curiosity. Children pointed at him excitedly, tugging on their parents' sleeves and asking if he was the guard who bowed. Adults approached him cautiously, thanking him for his act of kindness and expressing hope that he wouldn't face trouble for stepping outside the rules. Each interaction reinforced the magnitude of what had happened, and the responsibility he now felt to uphold its message. Though he couldn't engage in conversation while on duty, James absorbed the energy of the crowd around him. He noticed the way people spoke more thoughtfully, their voices softer and their expressions warmer. It was as though the moment had created a ripple effect, encouraging everyone to pause and reflect on the importance of respect and connection. Even those who hadn't witnessed the exchange firsthand seemed affected by the atmosphere. It was impossible to ignore the sense of unity that permeated the air. By mid-afternoon, the story had spread far beyond the palace grounds. Social media platforms were ablaze with posts, videos, and comments celebrating the encounter between Thomas and James. Hashtags like "Respect knows no bounds" and "Honoring heroes" trended globally, drawing millions of views and shares. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting interviews with eyewitnesses and sharing clips of the emotional moment. Journalists praised the guard's decision to break protocol, calling it a triumph of humanity over formality. And a reminder of the power of mutual respect. The palace itself eventually released a statement addressing the incident. While emphasizing the importance of maintaining tradition, officials acknowledged the significance of the moment and commended James for his thoughtful gesture. Today, we witnessed an act of compassion and recognition that transcends rules and regulations, the statement read. It is a testament to the enduring bond between those who serve, whether in uniform or in civic duty. The word struck a chord with readers worldwide, sparking further discussions about the balance between tradition and human connection. Back at the gates, the crowd continued to grow, drawn not only by curiosity, but also by a desire to be part of something larger than themselves. Families posed for photos near the spot where Thomas had saluted, hoping to capture a piece of the magic. School groups gathered nearby, listening intently as teachers explained the historical context of the event and encouraged students to think critically about the values it represented. Even seasoned travelers, accustomed to seeing iconic landmarks, admitted they'd never experienced anything quite like this before. One particularly touching moment came when a young boy, no older than 10, approached Thomas shyly. Clutching a small toy soldier in his hand, he looked up at the veteran with wide, earnest eyes. "Are you a hero?" he asked innocently. Thomas chuckled softly, kneeling down to meet the boy at eye level. "No, son," he replied gently. "I'm just someone who did my job, like a lot of other good people. But if you want to be a hero, all you need to do is care about others and try your best to help them." The boy nodded solemnly, hugging his toy soldier close as his mother snapped a photo of the exchange. Throughout the afternoon, similar scenes played out repeatedly, moments of connection that bridged age, background, and experience. Tourists from different countries exchanged stories of their own veterans, finding common ground despite language barriers. Elderly visitors reminisced about their own memories of war and peace, their voices filled with nostalgia and wisdom. Younger generations listened attentively, absorbing lessons they might not have learned in textbooks. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestone pathways, Thomas decided it was time to leave. He had spent hours engaging with strangers, sharing smiles and exchanging nods of gratitude. But he knew he couldn't stay forever. With a final glance at the palace gates, he adjusted his cap and turned to walk away. As he did, a spontaneous round of applause erupted from the crowd. People clapped and cheered, calling out words of thanks and farewell. Some even saluted him, mirroring the gesture that had started it all. James watched silently from his post, his chest swelling with pride. Though he couldn't join in the applause, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that his decision had touched so many lives, including his own. For years, he had viewed his role as a royal guard as a symbol of duty and discipline. Now he saw it differently, as an opportunity to honor others and uphold the values that truly mattered. When Thomas finally disappeared from view, the crowd began to disperse slowly. But the spirit of the day remained, lingering in conversations and reflections long after the physical gathering had ended. Parents promised their children they would return someday, hoping to relive the magic of the moment. Friends vowed to keep the memory alive, sharing the story with anyone who would listen. And James, standing tall under the fading sunlight, felt a renewed commitment to his role, not just as a guardian of tradition, but as a steward of humanity. In the days that followed, the legacy of the encounter continued to grow. Letters of gratitude poured in from around the world, addressed to both Thomas and James. Schools incorporated the story into lessons about respect and service. Veterans organizations highlighted it as an example of the enduring bond between those who serve. And countless individuals, inspired by the moment, resolved to live with greater empathy and purpose. What had begun as a quiet salute between two men had blossomed into something far greater, a reminder that acts of kindness, no matter how small, have the power to transcend boundaries and unite us all. As the palace gates closed for the evening, the echoes of that day's events lingered on, carried forward by the hearts and minds of everyone who had been touched by the unforgettable moment. The days following the unforgettable encounter at the palace gates brought a wave of unexpected attention and reflection. Thomas, the veteran, returned to his quiet life. But the memory of that morning lingered with him like a warm glow. Back, in his modest home, he found himself replaying every detail. The crisp salute, the guard's respectful bow, the applause from the crowd. He had never sought recognition for his service, yet he couldn't deny the profound impact the experience had on him. It wasn't just about personal validation. It was about the collective acknowledgement of sacrifice, duty, and humanity. Letters began arriving in Thomas's mailbox, each one carrying words of gratitude and admiration. Some came from strangers who had seen videos of the moment online, while others were penned by fellow veterans expressing solidarity and pride. One letter, written by a young girl named Emily, stood out among the rest. "Dear Mr. Veteran," it began, her handwriting wobbly but earnest, "thank you for being brave and strong. My grandpa was a soldier too, and I miss him very much. You made me feel proud of him again." Enclosed was a drawing of two figures standing side by side, one wearing medals, the other in a red tunic and bearskin hat. The simplicity of the gesture moved Thomas deeply, reminding him that even the smallest acts of kindness could leave lasting impressions. Meanwhile, James, the royal guard, faced a mix of emotions as news of his actions spread. While many praised him for breaking protocol to honor Thomas, there were inevitable questions about discipline and tradition. His superiors called him into a private meeting, where they discussed the incident at length. To James's relief, their tone was not one of reprimand but rather thoughtful consideration. They acknowledged the significance of the moment and commended him for handling it with grace and sensitivity. However, they also reminded him of the importance of maintaining order, a lesson James took to heart without resentment. After all, he understood that traditions existed for a reason, even if exceptions sometimes needed to be made. Outside the palace walls, the story continued to captivate audiences worldwide. News outlets revisited the event, interviewing historians, military experts, and cultural commentators to explore its deeper implications. Social media remained abuzz, with users sharing personal anecdotes inspired by the encounter. Veterans recounted their own experiences of being honored, or wishing they had been, while civilians reflected on the ways they could show greater appreciation for those who served. The phrase "respect knows no bounds" became a rallying cry, symbolizing the universal value of recognizing human dignity and shared purpose. Back at the palace, the ripple effect of James's actions influenced not only his fellow guards, but also visitors who came to witness the iconic landmark. Tour guides incorporated the story into their narratives, describing how a single act of compassion had transformed an ordinary day into something extraordinary. Families brought their children to the gates, pointing out the spot where Thomas had stood and explaining why it mattered. Teachers organized field trips using the event as a real-life example of empathy and respect. Even seasoned travelers accustomed to marveling at architectural wonders admitted the palace now held a new layer of meaning for them, a testament to the enduring power of connection. For James, life resumed its usual rhythm, though he carried the lessons of that day with him always. Each time he donned his uniform and took his place beside the towering columns, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His role was no longer just about guarding a historic site. It was about embodying the values of honor, humility, and service that transcended time and tradition. Strangers still approached him occasionally, thanking him for what he had done or asking if he remembered the veteran. Though James maintained his professional demeanor, his eyes softened with warmth, silently acknowledging the bond he had formed with Thomas, and by extension, with everyone who had been touched by the moment. Thomas, too, found himself changed in subtle yet meaningful ways. The letters and messages he received reinforced his belief in the goodness of people, even in a world often divided by differences. He began volunteering more frequently at local veterans organizations, sharing his story and encouraging others to open up about their experiences. At community events, he spoke passionately about the importance of remembering, not just the battles fought, but the bonds forged and the sacrifices made. His presence became a source of inspiration, particularly for younger generations eager to learn from those who had walked the path before them. Months later, the palace hosted a special ceremony to commemorate the encounter. Both Thomas and James were invited to attend, along with representatives from veterans groups, military organizations, and civic leaders. As they stood together once more, this time under the watchful eyes of hundreds of guests, the atmosphere was electric with emotion. Speeches were delivered, tributes were paid, and tears flowed freely as people celebrated the unity and respect that had emerged from such a simple act. At the conclusion of the ceremony, Thomas addressed the audience. Speaking slowly and deliberately, he reminded everyone that heroes weren't defined by fame or glory, but by the choices they made to help others. "We all have the power to make a difference," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "Whether it's through a salute, a bow, or simply a kind word, we can honor one another and keep the spirit of service alive." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing across the palace grounds. As the event drew to a close, James stepped forward to shake Thomas's hand. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, they shared a mutual understanding. The legacy of that day would endure far beyond either of them. It was a reminder that acts of kindness, no matter how small, could bridge divides and inspire change. And though the palace gates would continue to welcome countless visitors in the years to come, none would forget the story of the war veteran and the royal guard whose shared moment of respect had touched hearts around the world. In the end, what remained was not just a tale of two men, but a testament to the enduring power of humanity. It was proof that even in a world filled with noise and distractions, moments of genuine connection could cut through the chaos and remind us of what truly mattered. For Thomas, James, and everyone who had witnessed or heard about their encounter, it was a lesson worth carrying forward, a beacon of hope, gratitude, and unity that would shine brightly for generations to come.